Hey, it's Dylan with Oscillator. Today we're going to do a walkthrough of the session file for my brand new song, Undefined, which sounds like this. The link to stream the song will be in the description, so head there after the video to stream it, download it. But for now, let's jump into the session. So a few notes about the session itself. I always organize my tracks in the same order of categories. So starting with the vocals, then drums, bass, synths and instruments, and then effects at the bottom. I highly recommend that you do some kind of organization scheme like that. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but that's what I do. So why don't we start by taking a look at the vocals? Because vocals are the most important part of any song that has vocals in it. And this song is kind of cool because the vocals are a vocal sample that I downloaded from Splice. It's sort of like a verse pre-chorus type vibe, and then I've got a drop. So I took these vocals and I messed them up a bunch, made them a little bit weird, and I think it ended up being pretty cool. First, I'll play for you the original vocal sample as it came from Splice.
Suppose there are times when you lose your troubled mind. Suppose there are times when you're feeling undefined.
As you can tell, it's like an R&B, slow, kind of female vocal sample. However, I made it a little bit different for my song, so I'll play for you the second verse so you can get a taste for the vocals.
Suppose there are times when you lose your troubled mind. Suppose there are times when you're feeling undefined. Suppose there are days when you call it's time to quit. That's when you call me and know just what to say.
So as you can see, my song is at 140 beats per minute and the vocals sample is at 98 originally. What I did though is I brought the vocal sample into my project and I changed the warp mode to repitch. What that did is it pitched it up quite a bit, obviously, since I sped it up so much, but then I took the pitch down using Little Alter Boy. So this is a cool plugin from Soundtoys, very popular. I use it all the time. You can control the pitch and the formant with this. So that's what I have. I have the pitch down by 6 semitones and the formant down by 10. So without the Little Alter Boy, this vocal sample sounds like this. Not what I wanted. So I changed the pitch and the formant. That to me has like a really cool, interesting sound. The other thing that I did with this vocal sample is I automated both the pitch and the formant. So if I enter my automation windows and I go to Little Alter Boy and pitch, you will see that right here I've got this rise in the pitch automation. And that just gives it that little scoop right there. Without that automation, sounds like this. I like to have the turn to gray. And then here I've got the automation pitched down here. Then I also have some automation on the formant right before the drop. That just gives it a nice little sort of weird scoop going into the drop. The other thing that I want to mention about vocals is I always try to do some automation on the return tracks. So down here I have a Vox verb and a Vox delay. And I like to use automation to send the tracks to these returns at different levels throughout the song. So if I open up my automation window again, and let's go to the mixer and to the Vox delay, you'll see that right before the drop here, I've got the send going 100% to the return. And that gives me that extra delay tail on that vocal part, but I don't want the delay the entire time. So throughout the verse and pre-chorus, the delay send is at -55. So it's pretty low, just a tiny bit. But then in certain parts, I automate the return level all the way up so that we hear those delays, like right here in the verse. You can hear the tail coming there. So that's really important. Always try to do some automation with your returns. That kind of gives the track like life. Now let's move on to the drums. So I think this song actually started with this drum pattern. A really simple kick snare. This is a pack that came with Ableton called Wrong-Sided Kit, and I believe I kept all of the same samples, although it's possible I may have hot swapped some of them. I just can't remember. As you can see here in the MIDI roll, it's just a kick and a snare. This clave, I think I muted anyways. Yeah, so the clave doesn't even exist. But here's what it sounds like. You may be thinking, why is the second kick a lower velocity? And that's because I used this two-step shuffle groove on this MIDI pattern. If you open up your groove pool, you will see that you can assign the groove to these different parameters: quantize, timing, randomness, and velocity. I have this two-step shuffle groove affecting the timing and the velocity. Certain grooves have different, they play around with the velocity of the notes in the groove, and I really like the way that sounds. So that's basically all that kick and snare does the entire song. This is a little bit different for me. I usually get pretty wild with my drums, and in this one I try to keep things pretty simple. I think this is the first time that I've had the kick and the snare on the same track. I usually mult them out into different tracks, but for this one they just sounded so nice together. You know, these drum kits that come with Ableton have like a few macro controls already set, and I just really liked the way it sounded, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. So that's the kick and the snare, kind of the meat of the groove. Next, we've got this percussion loop, and it sounds like this. Pretty standard UK garage percussion tops loop. However, I changed this quite a bit because it was very busy. So I went into the sample, I set it to the beats warp mode. I have the preservation on as transients, but I changed the loop mode to just forward, just one forward like this, and then I changed the transient envelope down. That helps me keep these percussion pieces a little bit tighter. So it's almost like using a transient shaper where you're not getting the in-between artifacts. I just wanted it to be really tight and clean. I also went through and manually adjusted every single one of these warp markers because the original loop was like super swung. My song has a swing to it, but this loop had too much swing. So I had to go through and move each one until it felt right. Major pain. However, once you do it to the single, 16 bar loop, you can just copy and paste that throughout the song. And it's always nice at the end of the day to feel like the loop is your own now. So whether you rearrange it a little bit, change the sound somehow, for some reason I always like to make it feel like I did something. I didn't just copy and paste a loop. Maybe that's just me. So with the kick and the snare and the percussion loop together, we sound like this. So now you're starting to get that garage feel. Throughout the verses, the drums kind of do something like that, and then I've added quite a few other percussion instruments, but I tried to keep each one pretty minimal. So, for example, I've got this tambourine that happens in the drop, which sounds like this. So this is a swung tambourine that I just programmed in this MIDI pattern, and you can see I've got some velocity differences here, which gives it a little bit more of the natural feel, plus the swing. So this groove is set to swing 16ths at level 59. So I'm not using the two-step shuffle, I'm using a swing. So it's got a little bit different of a push and a pull, but I think that gives it a nice feel with the kick and the snare and the percussion loop. We've got some open hi-hats here, and then some extra hats that happen on the offbeats. Gives it a little bit more of that pulse. Here's a very cool clap effect. And some extra rim shots, some extra shakers and things like that. Little pieces that I put through. For these, I had a shaker sample and I just placed them in throughout the drop, and then instead of having these tiny little cuts, I like to consolidate it into like a 4-bar audio region. And as you can see, there's some variation that goes through. So 1 cut here, 2 here, 1 here, and 3 here. So that's always a little bit different, but not totally random. And that's what gives a song an interest, even if it's quite minimal. So this is obviously just a shaker part, but there's something about having the slight variation as it moves through. The other thing that I'll mention about my drums is that I have a lot of things coming in and out. So the second half of the drop actually starts here on bar 64, but I have certain things not come in until the 3rd beat. So that gives it a nice movement as well. This clap, for example, hits on beat 2 of that second half of the drop. And then right before it, I've got this bass drop. And then after it, the first time the bass notes move around, I'll tell you about that later. You don't have to have everything be perfectly square, filling out every single piece of your song. Feel free to just go in there, select some stuff, deactivate it, see how it sounds without it in that moment. Then lastly, I've got this weird fill. And I named it Weird Fill. Now, unfortunately, I don't quite remember how I made this, but this is what it started with, this Louis Vuitton sample. And then I'm pretty sure I stretched out the transient envelopes and then automated the transposition. But to be honest, I don't exactly remember. So I printed it a long time ago. I loved the way it sounded, so I just resampled it and it was cool. Later on in the song, we add some rides. A few extra little snare fills. This snare fill I took and I chopped it up, moved things around, and then stuck in a little tom fill at the end. So again, it was a really cool drum fill as is, but I always like to make it a little bit different so that when I'm listening, I know that everything I did, I kind of made it my own. So here's what the drums sound like all together in this drop. So as you can hear, it sounds pretty full. It's not really that many tracks. It's like 15 tracks. Everything kind of does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do more than it's supposed to do. So to me, that's the most important thing. I do have my drums going to a drum room. To me, even if it's really super low, which this drum room is pretty low in the mix, it glues everything together in a nice way, makes everything feel like it's existing in the same world. So now let's move on to the bass. I went through about 1 million different versions of the bass for this song, and it was totally driving me crazy, but I eventually settled on something I liked. I went around in a giant circle and came back to something really, really simple. So again, simplicity is the name of the game. So for this one, I used the Bass Max for Live device. So for this one, I've got the sine wave, a little bit of sawtooth, a 40% sub, so it's pretty beefy. And then if I go inside my MIDI region, a few things I would mention about the bass. I use 2 different lengths of the notes, so they're consistent, but there are 2 different lengths. So this is like a quarter note, and then this one is an 1/8 note. And I think it's important to be intentional about the lengths of notes. Let me show you how it sounds. As you can hear, there are the 2 different lengths and they sort of have a different feeling in the track. I have a kickstart on this, so this is the volume pumping thing. One thing I mentioned about the kickstart is that I have the mix at 70%. I would maybe even turn this down slightly. It's too late now, but yeah, 50% maybe would have been better. And the other thing that I like to do with the kickstart that maybe a lot of people don't do is play around with the position of the waveform. So on this one, I moved it to the left 1 click. And that just makes it a little bit tighter in the front, and then it will cut off at the end, which gives it a little bit of a sort of sampled feel, which is kind of cool. Now, I've only got 2 notes, so 3, I guess, the E, the D, and the F. And then in the drop, I have 1 point where the bass really goes outside of the register of those 3 notes. And then it goes up here to another E and an A. What's cool about this is that it happens after some other movement things in the middle of the drop. So listen. So it rises up there in that second half of the drop after this like swoosh and a bass drop. And I think that sort of flowing movement is really important in your productions. So here's a sub bass drop that I created. Sounds like this. This is just a wavetable synth preset that I created. In fact, I'll leave a link to this preset in the YouTube description so you can download it. I use this like almost in every song just because it's fun to have these sub drops. Go ahead and download that and you can use it in your song. And then in the bridge, we have 1 more bass, and that sounds like this. So just one note, but with a really sort of long legato pitch bend to it. And I wanted that bridge to sort of feel like underwater. So I used an octave on the pitch bend, and then I created MIDI envelopes to automate that pitch drop down. So that's the bass. Now let's move on to some of the synth instruments. The main synth instrument for this song is a pretty simple sine wave keys sound that I designed. So this was using Anna 2, and in my instrument rack I added another wavetable and another Anna 2, but decided not to use either of those. So I just kept it on the main Anna 2 synth. If we go inside the plugin, I'll show you a little bit of the sound design. So I used the sine wave PWM as the oscillator. It's only one voice, so it's not detuned, it's not spread out, it's pretty mono. And I used a low pass filter, just like a basic siney keys sound. A few other things to mention is that I did put an automation on the morph, and going from the pre-chorus into the drop, you can see I've got a rise on this parameter. That gives it a little bit more color as it swoops into the drop. And then as far as the chain on this instrument, you can see I added a bunch of stuff and then muted it all. So I have an imager, a compressor, a little bit of EQ, well, quite a bit of EQ. And then I've got a utility plugin at the end that's doing something like this. So I created this automation loop on the gain. And this does sort of like what the Kickstart or LFO tool does. I like to use the utility plugin and draw in these automations because you have a lot more control. Ableton's automation capabilities are really pretty amazing. And so I like to draw these in like this because I can have it exactly the way I want it. And what this does just creates a little bit of a volume pump, and you can hear what it sounds like and watch like this. So try this. Try doing it with panning. You can try doing it with stereo stuff on the width of the utility plugin. This utility plugin is a real piece of work. So that's the main synth element. I'll tell you about a few other things that I like. So I also included this organ. And what's cool about this, other than the sound is just sick, the chord changes are slightly different from the chord changes of the main keyboard element. So let's play these two together. So as you can see, they're playing off each other a little bit. It's like a counter melody, but it's very low in the mix. It just kind of beefs up the snare. And the song is so minimal, it's nice to have just those little colorful moments that enhance that part and doesn't make it busy, but it gives it some slight changes as we move through the different sections. And then I have these other two synth leads in the drop. So the first one sounds like this. And this is two sounds layered in the same chain. So the first is this Anna 2 synth. I think this is just a preset. It's kind of the main part of that sound, but I also added this dub effect. This is a sample with like a delay thing. It's like an effect sound, but I repitched it to match with the lead, and then I just used this as a parallel chain. Gives it a little bit more of like a dirtiness because it was a little too pretty before without it. So together they sound like this. Subtle, but I think it gives it some dirt, which is cool. And then I have this tech lead over here. Pretty simple, but what's cool about this is these little moments. So again, the first two notes are the same length, and then I've got a little ghost note here before the third and the fourth notes. And it's very subtle, but you can hear the difference in the context of the whole song. Just that little jump, that ghost note makes a big difference. And then again, in terms of structuring your counter melodies, this one has that repeated two notes, the A and the G, and then halfway through we throw in a C, and then at the very end, instead of the C, we throw in a D. So just that slight variation, you can hear it all together. That's how you make your counter melodies. You've got to think like familiar enough, so not totally random, familiar enough, but slight variations. And then if you can have them overlapping like that, that's when I think you can make some real magic with your productions. And then lastly, some strings. So these strings are super basic, but I think the cool part is that I added this one little 16th note here. So all these are just straight up quarter notes, and then a 16th note happens halfway through. So you can hear that here. And that just surprises the listener just a little bit and makes it feel exciting. So you can hear it in context now. And it's on the third bar, so not the fourth. It's not right before the midpoint. It's like at the end of the third bar. So again, like we're just creating these moments that surprise the listener. You know, nobody's going to be able to tell, oh, I like how you added the 16th note on the strings on the third bar instead of the fourth. You know, nobody's going to be able to articulate that really, but everything in conjunction with itself, psychoacoustically, makes the song feel interesting. All right, so we moved through the vocals, the drums, and the synths, and now we're on to the effects. One thing that I try to keep in mind with effects is I try to make sure that the song does what I want it to do emotionally and dynamically without any sound effects. Obviously, there are limitations to this because depending on the genre, some effects are going to be like really crucial to the sound. But I always try to mute my effects and make sure that it's still exciting without these like giant swooshes and impacts and explosions and bah, bah, bah. So if your song can be exciting without those effects, then you know, okay, I'm in a good spot and I can use these effects to like just bump it up to go from 9 to 11 rather than going from 4 to 11 with your effects. You want your song to already be at level 9, and then you can push it to 11. So that being said, let's take a look at some of my effects. This effects delay thing is like a guitar reverb print that I made. I'm not sure how I did this. I think I printed it from... Yeah, I honestly don't remember. Unfortunately, I do this all the time. I resampled it and I just don't remember. But one thing I will note about this is that pay attention to where it comes in that section. So it's on the 1E and so it's the and it's the 16th bar, whatever. You can see where it is. It comes in right here. That's cool. Like you would think, oh, let's put it right on the downbeat, but we have enough happening on the downbeat, and this gives it that little jump. It's like right before the second beat. Like that. Again, I've got a sub bass drop. So this one is pretty similar to the bass drop in the drop itself, but this is a little bit more just like boomy, and it's lower in the mix, so it just gives it like a hit. So in context, you can hear it. And there's no bass there in the pre, so this gives it just a little bit of oomph, and then we can wait for the bass to come in at the drop. Here's a Medicine riser. I love Medicine and sounds sick. It's pretty low in the mix. As you can see, what I'll do a lot of times is lower the decibel on these risers by like 30 decibels, because I just wanted to add a little bit of movement and not be so prominent. Another thing to mention is that this riser I have cutting out 1 bar before the drop. You don't have to always have everything go right up to the line. You can have things cut out, pause, come back in, and that will make it sound different. I've got another riser. This one I'd sound designed with Serum, and it sounds like this. And again, that drops out on beat 4. My vocal part comes back in, and that leads into the drop. So let's listen to that in context. And I've got that little drum fill that happens there as well. So I wanted to create more space for that. All of these risers stop 1 bar before the drop. So we have that space for the drum fill, in the vocal part to take us into the drop. Since I designed this Serum preset, I'll put this in the YouTube description as well, so you can download this preset. Now this noise hit, let's take a look closely at this file. As you can see, it's called Never Let You Go V126. That's because I stole this sample from another song that I was working on before this song, because I did a bunch of like kind of fun effect stuff in that song and I really liked a lot of them. So these two FX samples come straight from that project. Like literally I went into the stems that I sent to the mixer, pulled them out and put them in my song and then moved them into the right place. All that to say, you know, you don't have to make extra work for yourself. So if something works and it sounds cool, you can reuse it in your next song. Why not? Don't be afraid of that. It's not like everything has to be new. In fact, a lot of times it's a good idea to reuse samples so that you have a consistent sound that you create. So this one is a beat 2 and 3 like white noise hit. And that's kind of like the Calvin Harris thing. He always has like extra white noise on beat 2. You can listen for that in his songs. And then this one is like a downer. I don't know why I called it riser. I should have called it downer. And before we go, I will also mention that I have a return track for the instruments to live in a room and a return track for delay on the instruments. Room, I like to send all of the synth instruments to this room as well. Same principle as with the drum room. I don't always do this, but I recommend at least trying it because it can help glue those instruments together. With the instrument delay, be careful with delays because they can make your track a little bit messy. Reverbs can too. With the delay, I'll send tracks to the instrument delay, but definitely automate this because that's what makes it cool. You can throw something into the delay for just one moment and it sort of trails off and it gives your song a real dynamic specialness. Then the last thing, let's take a look at my master track. So I have 3 plugins on my master and these are all for an effect. So I don't usually have stuff on the master when I'm mixing or when I'm producing. That's me. I know some people like to have their mastering chain going, but here I've got a phaser flanger, a phaser, and the auto filter. And that's because I have this one moment where everything, 2 moments where everything kind of sweeps down. So you can see here I've got an automation on all of these different parameters on the master track, and that gives me this little moment. The auto filter frequency goes down, the phaser dry wet goes up, and it creates this moment. And then we do it again later on. And the thing that I would mention about these automations to keep in mind is that it really does make a difference if this line is curved or not, or where the automation goes to. And then as you can see, I've got all of my automations ending right in the beat before that next downbeat. And that's because I wanted everything to just be clean right before the hit. I think when I first created this automation, I had all these points resetting right on the downbeat, but it did something weird with the way the vocals sounded. So these little details do make a pretty big difference. Just make sure that the automation is doing what you want it to, rather than what you don't want it to do. So that's my song Undefined. If you have any other questions, please hit me up in the comments and I'll be sure to answer those. Check out the links in the description for where to stream the song and how to download the preset files that I mentioned in this video. And finally, if you are interested, I'm doing a remix contest for the song. The link to my other video where I talk about the remix contest is in the description as well. Basically, it's a lot of links. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for joining me. Talk to you guys later.